Opening the diagonal immediately prepares to pressure the d6 square and develop the king's bishop, creating early initiative. Preparing a pawn chain, black immediately asserts influence over the central d5 square, hinting at a solid defensive structure. Establishing central dominance, 2d4 immediately challenges black's pawn and opens lines for piece development. Challenging white's central grip, this bold pawn thrust immediately injects dynamism into the early game. Carving out central space immediately cramps black's queenside development, forcing them to find alternative avenues for piece activation. Developing the bishop outside the pawn chain immediately creates dynamic central tension and potential attacking prospects on the kingside. White bolsters central control and prepares for kingside development, aiming to exploit the bishop's active placement. Exchanging the bishop for white's knight opens lines and simplifies, aiming for active piece play on the queenside. Reclaiming central influence with the queen, white solidifies control over the e-file and prepares for rapid development of remaining pieces. Solidifying the pawn chain and preparing for piece development grants black essential central stability. Developing the knight to c3 solidifies control over the center, particularly the d5 square, and prepares for potential pawn breaks like c4, aiming to seize more territory and restrict black's pawn structure further. Bringing the queen to b6 immediately challenges white's central pawn on d4 and simultaneously eyes the kingside, forcing white to defend and potentially disrupting their knight development plans. Initiating knight development with this choice aims to bolster the kingside defense and prepare for castling, while simultaneously offering a flexible retreat for the queen should she face attack on the queenside. It subtly prepares for future pawn pushes in the center. Challenging the central pawn structure, this advance aims to unravel white's queenside pawns and potentially open lines for black's pieces, especially the rook on a8. Opening a diagonal for the queen and reinforcing the pawn structure, this capture aims to disrupt black's central pawn control and potentially create weaknesses in their queenside. Recapturing the pawn opens critical lines, allowing black's queen to exert pressure on the queenside and potentially target weak pawns while developing tactical opportunities in the center. Finally, the monarch finds sanctuary, unburdening the middle game of immediate defensive concerns and preparing to link the rooks. Developing the knight towards the center, aiming to control key squares and prepare for kingside castling, demonstrates a solid, albeit slightly passive, response to white's central pressure and queen activity. Opening up a long-range assault on black's queen, the knight galvanizes the queenside and prepares to seize control of vital diagonals, potentially forcing a pawn weakness or dislodging the queen to a less active square. Unleashing the queen to eye the queenside pawn structure, this maneuver immediately challenges white's advanced e5 pawn and creates immediate complications around the central files. Eliminating that pesky advanced pawn opens up the c-file, offering immediate pressure on black's queenside structure. Recapturing the pawn with the queen re-establishes material equality and opens the c-file for potential future pressure, but it does place the queen on a somewhat exposed square, potentially inviting further tactical skirmishes. Developing the bishop to a central square like this immediately challenges black's queenside structure, aiming to disrupt the coordination of their pieces and potentially create weaknesses on those squares. Circling back to the queenside, black seeks to reposition this valuable piece, potentially eyeing the now slightly exposed kingside or aiming to consolidate on the c-file. Launching a pawn offensive on the kingside, this move signals an aggressive intention to seize space and potentially create attacking avenues, though it simultaneously weakens the dark squares around white's king. An ambitious thrust for the knight, seeking immediate engagement on the kingside and aiming to disrupt white's pawn structure, though it could expose the king if black isn't careful with subsequent development. Securing the queenside pawn structure, this advance aims to prevent any immediate counterplay from black's rook on the c-file and to solidify white's central control, creating a robust pawn chain. Initiating a dual outpost threat on the d-file, black bravely ventures a knight towards the enemy's queenside, aiming to destabilize white's pawn structure and create potential imbalances. Establishing dominion over the central open file, the rook surges forward, preparing to double its presence and exert pressure along the d-file. Solidifying the kingside pawn structure, this move prepares for future defensive maneuvers and aims to prevent white's rooks from easily infiltrating via the g-file. Unleashing a pawn storm on the kingside, white aggressively challenges black's defensive structure, aiming to pry open lines for immediate attack and potentially expose the enemy monarch. A decisive shift in the pawn structure, black willingly trades off their active knight for white's well-placed bishop, a positional sacrifice that aims to open lines and potentially target white's central pawn push. This maneuver introduces new dynamics, particularly the potential for kingside activity if white's pawn structure becomes too rigid. The recapture on e3 completes white's queenside development and brings the queen back into play, aiming to exploit the weakened dark squares around black's king. Launching an attack on the kingside with a pawn storm, black bravely challenges white's central pawn structure and eyes potential weaknesses, aiming to disrupt white's comfortable position. Sharpening the kingside attack, this advance aims to gain more space and restrict black's knight. A bold repositioning of the monarch into a seemingly safe harbor, anticipating the storm brewing on the kingside where white's pawns have aggressively advanced. This maneuver aims to shield the king from immediate threats, but subtly invites white to continue their spatial expansion, potentially creating weaknesses for black to exploit later. Observe how this decision might influence the control of central files and the potential for future counterplay. Targeting the kingside, this knight maneuver seeks to exploit black's pawn structure and potentially open lines towards the vulnerable monarch after advancing. Exploring the queenside now, black's queen seeks refuge and potentially new attacking avenues. This repositioning hints at a desire to escape the pin along the d-file and perhaps prepare for a queenside pawn push or reinforce pieces on that flank. It's a fascinating dual-purpose maneuver, solidifying the queen's position while simultaneously eyeing potential weaknesses in white's otherwise solid pawn structure. The exchange on c5 earlier has left black with slightly less central pawn presence, so maneuvering the queen to a more active square on the flank becomes strategically important. This isn't merely a defensive shuffle. It could be the prelude to a subtle queenside expansion, aiming to disrupt white's kingside initiative. The queen's new post might also be aimed at creating threats against white's d4 pawn, a long-term target that has remained untouched for several moves. Observe how this queen placement might influence the subsequent development of black's rook on a8 or b8. Solidifying the kingside and preparing for a potential queenside thrust, this rook maneuver brings a valuable piece into the fray with a dual purpose, defending against any immediate kingside weakness while simultaneously eyeing open lines for future counterplay. Instead of defending the queenside immediately, rfc8 boldly stakes a claim on the open c-file, seeking to disrupt white's queenside pawn structure and create active counterplay. This aggressive stance acknowledges the inherent weaknesses created by white's pawn advances on the kingside and aims to divert white's attention away from their growing initiative. The challenge now lies in whether black can capitalize on this initiative before white's kingside attack fully materializes. Securing the queenside pawn structure prevents any immediate black intrusion on the b-file while preparing for a potential advance of the b-pawn, aiming to disrupt black's queenside harmony. Reinforcing the queenside and preparing to contest the open c-file, this maneuver aims to solidify black's position against white's encroaching pawn structure. Shifting the heavy artillery towards the queenside, white's rook now eyes the open c-file, preparing to contest black's control and potentially support a pawn advance on that flank, while simultaneously unpinning the knight on d4 and creating new avenues for piece activity. Challenging the queen's established dominion on the queenside, the knight embarks on an ambitious detour. Reinforcing the e-file, this rook's relocation prepares to contest the open column, potentially initiating a direct assault on black's queenside or supporting a pawn storm's advance. Shifting the rook to the center file, black aims to solidify its presence on the d-file and prepare for potential exchanges, a prudent step to relieve the cramped queenside and activate more pieces for the upcoming central struggle. Securing the monarch's sanctuary initiates a crucial defensive maneuver, acknowledging the latent dangers lurking on the king side. Seeking to unburden the queen side, black attempts to redeploy their knight. But this rerouting doesn't alleviate the pressure on the central pawn structure or immediately challenge white's increasingly coordinated pieces. Shifting the rook to the d-file solidifies white's central presence and prepares for potential action against black's queenside pieces while maintaining a defensive shield for the king. The rook's redeployment to the c8 square seeks to double down on control of the open c-file, potentially creating a formidable battery with its counterpart on the 7th rank should opportunities arise. Repositioning the rook to the e-file hints at a potential doubling of rooks, aiming to exploit the open file for pressure against black's king or potentially to support a pawn advance. Black continues their knight's circumnavigation, aiming to reposition it to a more active square, perhaps the f5 square once again, while solidifying their control over the central squares and defending the pawn chain from potential white advances. Repeating the rook to the d2 square creates a rather passive defensive setup, but perhaps white is aiming to shore up the kingside or prepare a central regrouping. It's a peculiar choice given the material balance and board activity, potentially signaling a desire to avoid any immediate tactical fireworks and instead slowly improve piece placement. This feels like a move born out of uncertainty, a slight sidestep rather than a decisive step forward, possibly hoping black will overcommit or miscalculate. This seemingly quiet maneuver on rc4 aims to achieve a twofold objective. Firstly, to contest control of the crucial c-file, preventing white from establishing a dominating presence, and secondly, to prepare for potential future advances with the knight on a5, perhaps aiming for b3 or even a direct jump into white's territory if opportunities arise. It's a subtle step that sacrifices immediate pawn structure fluidity for long-term positional pressure, a classic Caro-Kann gambit element manifesting in the mid-game. Unleashing a bold declaration, white boldly advances the queen, intending to exploit the open h-file and create attacking chances against black's seemingly secure monarch. This aggressive placement signals a shift from positional maneuvering to direct confrontation, aiming to pierce black's defensive shell. Securing the king behind a pawn shield suddenly feels quite precarious, as this maneuver creates potential entry points for white's attacking pieces along the now exposed king file. This reinforces the rook on the f-file, preparing to contest control and potentially launch an offensive, while simultaneously offering a potential defensive maneuver should black's pieces push too aggressively. Expanding on the queen side, black seeks to contest the open a-file and potentially launch a pawn storm against white's king, aiming to create counterplay while white is preoccupied with the central advance. Reclaiming the central square after black's well-placed knight maneuver brings the rook back into play, a necessary repositioning to avoid letting black dictate the tempo on the e-file. The knight's venture to the flank, nf5, aims to disrupt white's pawn shield and potentially exploit the weakened kingside, a bold but risky maneuver given the current piece placements. Snatching a pawn this way dramatically alters the central structure, forcing a reshuffling of black's forces. Opening up that kingside pawn structure feels like inviting trouble, especially with an exposed monarch. The immediate aftermath of that pawn push seems to create significant weaknesses around your king, potentially a target for future attacks. White's pieces are already poised to exploit these vulnerabilities. The current position is brimming with tension. White's queen now eyes the kingside, a shrewd repositioning after the material simplification, aiming to exploit the weaknesses created by black's pawn storm. This maneuver subtly prepares for a potential breakthrough, while simultaneously offering a degree of safety for white's own monarch should the opportunity arise for a swift exchange, simplifying into a more advantageous endgame. Suddenly, the seemingly quiet flank opens a door of opportunity, inviting the black king into a perilous dance with doubled pawns and an exposed royal court. The repositioning of the rook to the d-file is a strategic masterstroke, aiming to exploit the potential weaknesses around black's kingside and prepare for a swift pawn storm. This deliberate redeployment seeks to establish a dominant presence on an open file, creating long-term attacking possibilities while keeping the king safe. It demonstrates an understanding of the subtle nuances of positional play, patiently building pressure before launching a decisive assault. The black king now finds itself exposed to potential attacks down the open files, a significant positional concession for the sake of activity. Unlocking the d-file for immediate pressure on the weakened black king side. A bold but potentially risky maneuver, aiming to disrupt white's pawn structure and create attacking chances on the king side by threatening to capture the g-pawn. White seeks to exploit the exposed black king by creating attacking opportunities on the king side, specifically aiming to open lines with the pawn push. Unlocking the queen side with QB5 aims to create immediate queenside pressure and potentially disrupt white's coordinated pieces, particularly the rooks on the d-file. Securing the king's immediate safety by shifting it towards the center allows for greater defensive flexibility and prepares for potential pawn pushes on the king side, aiming to solidify the structure against black's active rook. Initiating a drastic simplification, this exchange on the d-file immediately opens up the possibility of a swift transition towards an endgame, likely trading off the most active attacking pieces. Opening the c-file now grants white significant central influence and prepares for potential breakthroughs. The passed pawn on the c-file, now supported by the rook and queen, presents a serious long-term threat to white's pawn structure, potentially forcing concessions or creating a decisive advantage if not handled with extreme care. Retreating the king offers a temporary reprieve, but the pawn structure is now severely compromised, creating potential weaknesses that black will surely exploit. Expanding the queenside pawn structure with the b-pawn aims to gain space and potentially create a passed pawn, but it also weakens the queenside further, potentially inviting white's king to advance or creating targets for future pawn storms. Securing the monarch against potential diagonal disruptions becomes paramount as the board simplifies. Unleashing a dynamic pawn thrust, black aggressively probes white's queenside, aiming to disrupt any comfortable defensive setup and create immediate imbalances. Unlocking the c-file is paramount. Capturing this pawn opens the door to immediate threats against black's awkwardly placed king. Opening up the queenside with this capture, black aims to exploit the weakened pawn structure and create dynamic counterplay. The king's relocation to g2 appears to be a slight positional refinement, seeking a safer haven from potential threats on the dark squares, and preparing for any potential exchange of pieces that might arise, aiming to simplify the position and perhaps avoid being caught in the crossfire of the queenside pawn storm that black is building. The black king now finds itself precariously exposed on the g-file, a direct consequence of the pawn storm initiated on the king side earlier in the game. The monarch ventures, seeking solace beyond the immediate fray, a surprising act of mobility in a congested central position. The black queen, having danced around the king side for a while, now takes a central position, potentially preparing to infiltrate white's territory or offer a peace exchange that could simplify the game. Steering the rook to the d-file initiates a strategic repositioning, aiming to bolster the defense of the d-pawn and potentially initiate an attack on the queen side if the opportunity arises. The black rook, now freed from its defensive post, seizes the open first rank, initiating a potent counteroffensive and directly threatening white's king. The rook now aims to galvanize the king side, seeking to activate itself on the 7th rank or potentially support a push of the g-pawn if the opportunity arises to create a passed pawn down the flank. Harnessing the open file for a counterthrust, the rook charges forward, daring white to find a safe haven for its vulnerable monarch. The king's shelter now appears quite porous with the advance of that pawn. A surprisingly tranquil retreat, this knight embarks on a journey to a more active square, potentially igniting threats along the central files or even aiming for a surprise infiltration on the queen side. Seizing the open files with the rooks seems to be white's immediate goal after the recent exchanges, aiming to put pressure on the black king's defenses. A final attempt to dislodge the enemy king, but it appears the defense has solidified around it.